What's up guys, my name is Ace, and one of the big things that's different this time around with Modern Warfare 2 compared to most other Call of Duty games is our idle sway, or aiming stability, or aiming idle stability, whatever you want to call it. Basically, when you're standing still and aiming down sight with your gun, how much is your sight going to be swaying around without any input from you whatsoever? Now, of course, idle sway has always been a factor in Call of Duty. It's always existed. However, in Modern Warfare 2, it seems like they really ramped up the amount that your sights are going to be moving around when aiming down sight. And they've also made this a much bigger part of your attachment selection than ever before in Call of Duty. In fact, it's probably one of the most common variables with a wide variety of different attachments, whereas many other variables, they only apply to a certain attachment type, or maybe one or two attachment types. You have the potential to impact aiming stability with just about any one of your attachment slots in the game, whether directly or through tuning. And as a result, I did want to have a deep dive here into aiming stability and specifically how it impacts the recoil of your gun. Because while it doesn't directly impact any of the typical recoil stats you'd see, it definitely does have an impact on the recoil that you experience in the game. So diving right into this, I'm going to start this off with the Vel-46, or MP7. What I did here is I created two builds. Both of these builds have identical recoil stats, so they have all the same attachments that impact recoil. However, with one of the builds, I tuned everything to give us the worst possible aiming idle stability, and I assured while tuning I wasn't impacting any actual recoil values as well. Typically we're just tuning away from like aim walking movement speed, for instance, which doesn't impact our recoil while standing still. And then for the other build, I went in the opposite direction. I tuned to give us the best possible aiming stability, and I also popped the shark fin on there since that only impacts stability, it doesn't impact our recoil at all. And when we look at the side-by-side here, you can see there's a really big difference in how much the gun is swaying around. On the left, there is a ton of sway. That gun is moving all over the place. Whereas on the right, sure, there's still some sway there, but it's not nearly as extreme. And when we look at a recoil comparison between these two, not surprisingly, the total magnitude of the recoil is identical, but you'll notice the shapes are a little bit different here. The recoil patterns are definitely different between these two, despite the fact that no actual recoil values have changed. And in this case, I think the best way to compare these two is to draw a rough recoil path, the general path that our recoil followed. Although, of course, some shots will deviate from this recoil path a little bit. This is just the general paths that we were seeing here. And when we look at that, you can see when we have really high aiming idle stability, we get much more consistency in this recoil path. And we don't get any really sudden or sharp movements to the left or to the right or anything. There's no big zigzags there. It's more of a smoothed out curve as it kicks upwards. Whereas when we have the really low idle stability, you can see really sharp jumps to the left or to the right, and there doesn't really seem to be much rhyme or reason behind that. It's basically just following your sway of your gun as you're firing. So aiming idle stability absolutely impacts the recoil path of your gun, and having a low idle stability can make it a lot more randomized and harder to control and predict. Now, I'm sure many of you guys were already aware of this. This is something I have been mentioning basically since the launch of Modern Warfare 2, since I did some basic tests early on, but I haven't really shown that to you guys until now, and I also wanted to see just how important this is and how much it can potentially impact your recoil path. And at least with this MP7 comparison, that's quite a big difference, and I would definitely prefer the build on the right compared to the build on the left when it comes to controlling that recoil. Now, of course, that is just looking at the Vel-46. What about a different gun? Well, I decided to go with the M4, and I did the exact same thing. We have two builds that are nearly identical, at least all of the recoil stats are identical, and I just isolated the aiming idle stability stats to have one with really bad idle stability and one with really good idle stability. And then once again, I did the same recoil comparison side by side here with both of these builds, and this was our result this time. And when it comes to this, I'd say the difference wasn't nearly as noticeable. I was actually quite surprised to see this when I did this recoil test, since there was such a big discrepancy in idle stability. And if we do the same sort of thing that we did with the previous build, where we draw sort of a recoil path with each of these recoil plots, I wouldn't really say there's a significant difference between these two, and if anything, I would lean slightly more in the direction of the left side recoil plots with low idle stability, which does seem backwards compared to what we just saw with the Vel-46. However, if you look at it in a different way in this particular case, and we remove that recoil path, we just look at the recoil plot, I would definitely prefer the recoil on the right side. And the big reason behind this is you'll notice that the bullets are much closer together, or at least much more consistently closer together. Whereas with low idle stability, after the first 3 or 4 shots fired, it kind of just depends, we're seeing a really big gap between those bullets. And that sort of a gap really comes into play, I've noticed, in the game. That's the type of thing that really suddenly and unexpectedly causes your gun to like kick over top of the enemy's head and causes you to lose a gunfight. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see a lot more consistency in that gap between bullets. So while these two different comparisons end up with a slightly different approach when analyzing the recoil plots, at the end of the day, I'm always going to be leaning toward having better aiming idle stability when it comes to recoil control, because one way or another, the less stability you have, the more randomness you're going to have in your recoil, and in general, the harder it's going to be to control that recoil. And that's something I just really wanted to highlight and bring attention to in today's video. Also, I did want to do the testing for myself to see just how important it really was, because while I knew it had an impact, I wasn't sure how much of an impact that it would have. And it turns out that impact is quite noticeable. And therefore, this stat definitely shouldn't be ignored if you're trying to create a build with accuracy in mind. It's not just the recoil control stats you want to look at, it's also your aiming idle stability. And that's not even mentioning the really obvious benefit of having better aiming idle stability, and that is your ability to hit your first shot accurately, especially at longer ranges, or if you have an enemy that's really using cover effectively, maybe all you can see is like the top of their head, for instance, or head glitching something really well. Obviously, you're going to have a much easier time hitting that shot with a setup on the right compared to the setup on the left. And with that, that is going to wrap it up for today's video on idle sway in this game. At the end of the day, I definitely recommend keeping this in mind, and I do consider aiming idle stability to be a very important stat in this game. It's one of the many reasons that I really like using the OLEV laser or equivalent. That's the one that does have the downside of having a visible laser beam, so enemies can see that. But a big upside here is it helps significantly with your aiming idle stability and therefore your ability to control recoil, while also giving you a faster aim down sight and sprint out time. To me, that is totally worth having a visible laser, at least for my playstyle. Although, of course, I understand if you are somebody that likes to hardscope a lot, you may want to go in a different direction, but I would still consider tuning in the direction of idle stability, regardless of which laser or flashlight you decide to use. Now, of course, that is just my opinion based on all the testing that I've done, as well as just my experiences with playing around with idle stability. I do know a lot of you guys would have already been very aware of this and familiar with this, but I did want to show just how important this is, even for those that are aware, and for those that aren't, hopefully this opens your eyes a bit more to the importance of aiming stability in this game. Now, I am really curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, were you aware of the fact that aiming idle stability has an impact on your recoil, even though it's not mentioned anywhere? And second, will you be making any adjustments to your attachments or your tuning now that you've seen how much aiming stability can impact your ability to control recoil? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.